During the late 90s and early 2000s, genre conventions in 3D games hadn't yet settled, and developers that would eventually become pretty big names were looking to make their mark. There were many evolutionary steps being taken in many different directions, and this was a time when risk was key to success, and new ideas were constantly being tried just to see what could become the new convention. It can be really interesting to take a look back at this sort of fast-paced time of change and experimentation to remember some of the steps that were taken, especially those that got overwhelmed by the constant forward march of the industry. So this is Oni, a third-person thing from 2001. It was developed by Bungie, as in that Bungie, before they went on to be known for creating Halo and now Destiny, although the studio specifically that created Oni was actually an offshoot that was developing at around the same time as the main studio was actually making the first Halo. The publishers for Oni also had some pretty big names, with the PC version being published by a gathering of developers. If you were a PC gamer back at this time, you definitely knew that name. They published everything from Jazz Jackrabbit 2 and Rune to things like Max Payne, Mafia, and Age of Wonders. There was also a really competent port of Oni on the PS2 that was handled by none other than Rockstar Games, and that's actually the version that I first played back in 2001. I had no idea, honestly, that there was even a PC version for a couple years, because I never actually saw a single copy of it anywhere. And in fact, the PS2 copy, which I still have, by the way, was the only one of that version that I saw as well, so as you'd expect, we're clearly within the realm of cult classic here. In Oni, we play as Konoko, a special agent of the TCTF who begins to discover things aren't as they seem, and that she was a bit of an unethical experiment herself. The setting was inspired by classic cyberpunk anime like Ghost in the Shell and Akira, and it shows with the themes of what it means to be human, unethical megacorporations, and even environmental activism. The tone's actually pretty dark overall, with an ending that's honestly sort of bittersweet after everything is said and done. It does suffer from the early 2000s problem of the voice acting being super cheesy for most of the characters, but Konoko's actress actually does a pretty good job, and the story overall makes for a nice cyberpunk thriller. The gameplay, though, is the real draw here. The genre is pretty hard to pin down, and tends to get lumped in with that vague, nebulous, totally not useful description of action-adventure. Basically, it's a third-person shooter, but with a lot less shooting and a lot more punching. The movement is the first notable aspect of the game's mechanics. It's somewhat weighty, has transitionary animations between attacks and turning in different directions, making the movement of your character feel like it has that weight to it. Today, with the ubiquitous physics engines and motion capture tech, it's pretty commonplace, but at the time, it was genuinely impressive. Oni also has a big focus on hand-to-hand combat, with combos, grapples, disarms, and special moves available in a pretty nice combat engine, and mechanics set up to encourage the scarcity of ammo, so fights often tend to be melee-centric. Punches, kicks, and throws can be combined in various different ways, even going so far as to have directional attacks. So, for instance, pressing back and kick doesn't cause Konoko to snap her direction backwards, but to stay looking forwards while performing a high backwards kick to enemies behind you without actually changing direction. I personally always loved how responsive and kinetic all these combos and directional strikes made the combat, and the only other game at the time that I can think of that had a similar feel to its melee was Draken the Ancient Gates. That's possibly a different topic for a whole new video, though. Inputting different combinations of directions and attacks could perform some powerful special moves that had pretty nice animations, and of course often resulted in characters saying the name of the attack and glowing, because why not? Even throws had a lot of variety, with different throws being performed depending on whether you press punch or kick and what angle you're approaching the enemy from. You can perform anything from the really oddly satisfying running neck twist that actually knocks an enemy down and acts as sort of a circular kick to any other enemies that were around them, to the instant kill spine-cracking back kick from behind. The guns eschew what we would consider a standard third-person shooter arsenal today and actually feel much more like the weapon selection of a classic shooter, which is pretty fitting considering the developers. Starting with a basic pistol and SMG, the arsenal quickly evolves to include stuff like the plasma rifle, a semi-auto energy weapon that fires constantly accelerating projectiles that require careful aim at range, the Scram Cannon, which is a homing swarm missile launcher that takes a short distance to arm the 8 missiles it fires with each trigger pull, to even more exotic and strange weapons. There is an arm-mounted constant beam that acts kind of like a combination between a laser and silly string that knocks enemies down very easily, a cluster mortar that can be bounced and detonated at will if you hold the trigger, and then there are my two personal favorites. The Mercury Bow, which is an insta-gib sniper rifle that fires bullets of frozen mercury and kills all but the strongest targets in a single hit, which is just as well because it has to refreeze between each shot, so it can only be fired roughly once a week. And the Screaming Cannon, which is a sort of ghost grenade launcher. It lobs out an air-bursting shell that contains a ghost-like entity known only as the Screamer that hovers around slowly and sucks the life out of anything it touches. Firing one of these into a crowd and then going into melee to use it as a supplementary energy vampire thing is a legit strategy, but be careful because if there's nothing else around for it to eat, it will chase you instead. The ammo system is a sort of dual universal kind that has ballistic magazines and energy cells, of which you can carry 6 of each, and the ammo counter for each weapon takes on a bit of a different style for every one, but with red pips for ballistic weapons and green for energy weapons, so there's never any confusion as to which weapon takes what ammo type. This is especially useful for the more exotic weapons later in the game. This is where resource conservation becomes an important part of gameplay. Ammo is scarce, and you can only hold one weapon at a time, making them a tool to dispatch distant enemies that also have weapons, so you aren't getting shot in the back the whole time you're trying to fight other enemies, and to bust out against enemies that you feel are currently too dangerous to fight in melee at the time. It's a nice way to encourage using the melee combat engine, while also giving you a reason to explore and an excuse to use the fun weapons. Exploration is definitely another important aspect of Oni. It has surprisingly large and open levels with secrets hidden all over the place for you to find, from precious ammo, damage-absorbing force field power-ups, cloaking fields, and health hypos. Exploring around the place is usually rewarded with these useful resources more often than not. The health system is another thing to mention. Limited health hypos will restore some of your health gauge, but there's also a section at the top end of it that acts as sort of an overcharge. If you use a hypo at roughly full health, the gauge will temporarily fill into this segment and give you boosted health and melee damage until it decays back down slowly, which is indicated by a nice sort of purple glow around your character. There are also helpful NPCs about that the enemies will often try to kill, but if you're fast enough to save them, they can reward you with hypos, ammo, power-ups, and even sometimes by operating certain terminals and pieces of machinery to help you get through the level. Some missions will even have friendly NPCs that will help you out in combat, as long as you keep each other alive. Enemy variety is a pretty high point as well. Many different kinds litter the levels, and each of them have their own melee combos and special moves to learn, making encountering a new enemy feel kind of like facing a character in a fighting game you haven't seen before. It starts with simple grunts, but quickly adds melee specialists with explosive dropkicks, heavy soldiers with heavier weapons and wrestling moves, up to cyberpunk ninjas with lightning powers and the ability to phase around the place, making things especially hard for you on the rooftop levels. There's even a cheat that actually lets you play as the enemies, and it's more than just a simple model swap. You can actually use all of their combos and special moves while you're playing as them, and Bungie actually bothered to program in unique inputs for their moves so you can learn to do them. This kind of gives me pangs of nostalgia for when cheats were really fun to mess with. As for getting the game to run, well, it actually won't work at all out of the box because it's expecting a Windows 98 installation, more or less. However, as with many cult classics on PC, there's a small but faithful community dedicated to creating tools to ensure that it can still work. For this video, I'm using a mod called the Anniversary Edition. It's absolutely necessary to make it work on modern systems. It includes some really nice utilities in it as well, like a key rebinder and even a mod manager that's connected to the database of Oni mods that still works, by the way, that you can easily browse and install them straight through the tool, which is sort of amazing if you think about it for the age of the game. The Anniversary Edition mod itself was updated as recently as 2017, and a few mods have even newer dates, including 2 that I saw last time that were just updated in 2020. There's still people thinking of this game. There's nothing else out there that was really like it. It's an experience that I wholeheartedly recommend for its uniqueness and the fact that the gameplay still holds up pretty well. It does have a few bugbears, of course. The block, for instance, is pretty much useless since it only blocks certain things, and it requires you to not press anything at all to trigger it, which you could just be dodging instead, and it eschews any sort of manual or quick save for the ever-present, at the time, unfortunately, checkpoint-based system, which isn't always generous. The game's actually pretty tough, honestly, and there aren't any difficulty settings or anything like that, and melee combat can be pretty punishing against the later game enemies, to say nothing about how your health gets shredded by ranged weapons, so carefully clearing an entire building just to get murdered halfway through the next one, only to discover that the entire 20 to 25 minute ordeal didn't have any checkpoints in it and that you have to start all over, can be frustrating. All that being said though, I think it's very much worth getting to grips for at least a good playthrough, because it's just so different. It was a breath of fresh air at the time that was lauded for its setting and unique mechanics, and considering there's very little else like it today, that air remains pretty fresh even now. As for the status of Oni as an IP, a sequel was actually planned and even made it to development under Angel Studios. They were known for making games like Midtown Madness, Smuggler's Run, and the Midnight Club racing games, and would become Rockstar San Diego later, which would go on to make Red Dead Revolver, both Red Dead Redemption games, and even helping with Grand Theft Auto 5. Obviously, that could have been pretty awesome, and it was actually given the title Oni 2 Death and Taxes, but was unfortunately cancelled for unknown reasons, end quote. It had much more complex melee mechanics, like parrying and expanded grappling, almost in the vein of later Metal Gear Solid games. It's thought that the title was possibly a light-hearted placeholder, since the leaked dev build contained strings identifying it instead as Oni 2 Rebirth. Unfortunately, since it never left the early dev stages, we'll never know what could have become of it, but hey, considering the love for the original has lasted this long, maybe someday they'll take notice, reveal that they remember it too, and start something more official. I can dream, at least. So that's Oni, a really cool snapshot of a particular point in time where games were changing, shifting, and becoming something altogether different than they had been. Look back into a forgotten window of an old building that might be worth wondering why is abandoned, and if maybe we should move back in and fix the place up with modern amenities and see what we can do there. All links and resources in the description of this video below that you can use to help get the game running, like the PC Gaming Wiki article with some useful resources and links, as well as the Oni Central page. That'll help you track down what you need to install if you'd like to play it yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching this retrospective of a game worth remembering, and I'll see you next time.